The Gilded Dust Chapter 1, The Gallows Bird. The stable was a graveyard of old smells, soured hay, rusted iron, and the heavy, sweet rot of horse manure. I liked it that way. It was honest. Unlike the town of Bitter Creek, which tried to pretend it wasn't dying, the livery stable knew exactly what it was, a place where things came to an end. I was 17, but my hands looked 40. They were permanently stained with axle grease and calloused from a year of throwing hay for men who didn't know my name. They just called me Boy, or sometimes Fetch. The storm was coming in from the painted desert, a wall of bruised purple, clouds that made the afternoon sun look like a healing wound. I heard him before I saw him, the rhythmic, wet thud of a horse pushed way past its limit. A man rode into the yard on a bay that was more lather than hide. He didn't dismount. He fell. I caught the reins before the beast could bolt, but the rider stayed down, curled in the dirt. He was dressed in Union blue, or what used to be blue before the dust and the blood turned it the color of a shallow grave. "Steady, boy," he wheezed. His eyes were milky, staring at something miles behind him. He reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a small, iron-bound ledger. It was wrapped in oilskin, slick with something dark. "Vance," the man whispered, the name coming out like a rattle of dry bones. "Don't let don't let him pick the bones." He shoved the book into my chest with a strength that shouldn't have been there. His fingers were cold, like river stones, in winter. Then, just as the first crack of thunder split the sky, his eyes went wide and flat. I stood there in the rain, the heavy weight of the ledger in my hands, listening to the sound of more hooves in the distance. They were coming fast, and they weren't coming to help. Cade's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The thunder was closer now, a low growl that shook the floorboards. He knew he should run, should shove that ledger deep into the damp hay and vanish into the shadows. But curiosity is a lethal disease in the West. He knelt in the mud beside the soldier. The man's face was a mask of gray exhaustion, his uniform tattered and caked in salt. Cade's fingers trembled as he reached into the man's inner coat pocket. He expected a flask, or maybe a letter home. Instead, his fingers brushed something, cold and heavy. He pulled out a silver pocket watch. It was dented, the glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but the weight of it felt wrong, too heavy for mere clockwork. He didn't have time to pry it open because his hand hit something else in the other pocket, a brass shell casing. It wasn't spent. It was engraved with a single word: Vance. The sound of hooves hit the edge of the yard, fast, rhythmic, and heavy. Not a traveler's pace, but a hunter's. Cade didn't think. He shoved the watch and the shell into his own pocket and scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft just as the stable doors creaked open. The silhouette of the marshal blocked out the dying afternoon light, the brass star on his chest glinting like a predator's eye. "I know you're in here, kid," the marshal's voice echoed, smooth and cold as a snake on a rock. "And I know he gave you something. Make it easy on yourself. Hand over the ledger, and maybe I won't have to explain to the town why I found another body in the straw." Cade pressed his face into the hay, the smell of dust filling his lungs. He could feel the ledger's sharp corners digging into his ribs. Cade didn't wait for the marshal's boots to hit the first rung of the ladder. He stayed low, belly crawling through the loose straw toward the back of the loft. Every shift of his weight felt like a gunshot in the silent stable. Behind him, he heard the heavy creak of the ladder groaning under the marshal's weight. He reached the loading window, a square hole used for winching hay from the street. It was a 15-foot drop into an alleyway slick with mud and shadows. Cade swung his legs over the edge, gripped the rough wood for a split second, and let go. He hit the ground hard, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze. The mud cushioned the blow, but his ankle flared with a white-hot spark of pain. He didn't stop. He rolled, tucked the iron-bound ledger deeper under his shirt, and vanished into the rain-drenched gloom of the alley just as the marshal's head appeared in the window above. Chapter 2. The Coat of the Lost, the Drunken Mule, was the only place in Bitter Creek that felt alive after dark, though it was a desperate kind of life. Cade slipped through the back door, dripping wet and shivering. He needed a place to think, but more importantly, he needed someone who knew how to read a soldier's map. He found Reeve in the corner booth, slumped over a glass of rotgut whiskey. Reeve was a man made of leather and regrets, a former scouter, who had seen too much of the war and spoke even less about it. "You look like you've been dragged through a cactus patch, kid," Reeve grunted, not even looking up. Cade didn't speak. He sat down and slid the brass shell casing, the one engraved with Vance, across the scarred wood of the table. Reeve's hand stopped mid-reach. He stared at the name, and for the first time his eyes sharpened. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. "Where did you get this?" "A dead man in the livery," Cade whispered. "He gave me a book. Said not to let the vulture pick the bones." Before Reeve could answer, a chair scraped back at the neighboring table. Marin, the gunsmith's daughter, leaned over. She had a smudge of soot on her cheek and a pair of brass goggles pushed up onto her forehead. She wasn't supposed to be in a place like this, but Marin went wherever there were gears to turn or secrets to grease. "The vulture isn't a ghost story, Cade," she said, her voice low and urgent. "My father says he's been shadowing the Union payroll routes for months. If you have his ledger, you don't just have a book. You have his heart in your hands." Reeve looked from the shell to Cade, then to the door. "If the marshal saw you, we're already dead. We stay here. We hang. We leave now. We might just die of thirst in the Badlands." "I'd rather die thirsty than on a rope," Marin said, her hand moving to the small, customized derringer tucked into her belt. "The marshal's got the stables locked down tighter than a drum," Marin whispered, her eyes darting toward the saloon's swinging doors. "But he doesn't know the catacombs like I do." "The silver mines?" Reeve's face soured. "Those tunnels haven't been braced since the '58 collapse. You're talking about crawling into a grave. Better a grave that might hold than a gallows that." "Definitely will," Cade said, his fingers tightening over the ledger beneath his coat. They slipped out through the kitchen, the smell of burnt grease giving way to the cold, metallic scent of the mountain air. Marin led them toward the edge of town, where the earth yawned open into a jagged, timber-framed mouth. The mine entrance was choked with tumbleweeds and warning signs that had long since rotted away. "Stay close," Marin warned, lighting a small, oil-wicked lantern she pulled from her pack. "The floor drops away in places. If you fall, don't bother screaming. No one will hear you." As they descended, the silence of the earth pressed against Cade's ears. The air turned thin and tasted of sulfur. Every creak of the old wood supports sounded like a bone snapping. Half a mile in, Marin stopped dead. She lowered the lantern. The light flickered across the walls, revealing something that wasn't silver ore. There were scratch marks in the rock, fresh ones, and tucked into a crevice was a single black feather. "He's already been here," Reeve breathed, his hand flying to the hilt of his knife. "The vulture. He didn't just follow the man to the stable. He's been circling the town the whole time." A low whistling sound echoed from the darkness ahead, a human whistle, tuneless and haunting. The Gilded Dust Chapter 3, Blood on the Floorboards. The whistling grew louder, bouncing off the damp stone walls. It sounded like a funeral march played on a flute made of bone. "Back up," Reeve hissed. But as they turned, a heavy thud echoed from the tunnel behind them. A massive timber beam had been kicked out, sending a cascade of rock and dust to seal the path they'd just taken. They were trapped in the dark with a ghost. "Cade," a voice called out. It wasn't the marshal's gravelly bark. This voice was smooth, cultured. and carried the chilling weight of a man who had seen the end of the world and found it boring. The ledger is a heavy burden for a boy who still has his baby teeth. Why don't you lay it down? I promise to make the rest of your life very, very short. Marin swung her lantern, the light catching a figure standing 20 feet ahead. He wasn't wearing a duster or a cowboy hat. He wore a high-collared black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in total shadow. In his hand, he held a long-barreled Colt, the metal etched with the same vine-like patterns Cade had seen on the silver watch. "Vance Thorne, run," Reeve growled, drawing his own rusted revolver. "Cade, Marin, find the air shaft. Go!" A gunshot shattered the silence, the flash blinding Cade for a split second. But the bullet didn't hit Reeve. It hit the lantern in Marin's hand, plunging them into absolute. Cade's thumb caught the latch of the silver watch in his pocket. The lid clicked open. A ghostly pale green luminescence spilled out. It wasn't clockwork. The dial was coated in a thick, eerie radium paint that shimmered in the absolute dark. The faint glow was just enough to reveal a jagged crawl space to their left, an old ventilation shaft choked with spiderwebs. "There!" Cade hissed, grabbing Eye. "Marin's arm. I see it," she breathed. Behind them, the darkness erupted. Vance didn't fire again. He moved. Cade heard the whisper of a heavy coat and the metallic clack of a cylinder spinning. Reeve fired a blind shot to cover them, the muzzle flash illuminating Vance for a terrifying heartbeat. He was smiling, his eyes reflecting the green glow of the watch like a wolf's. Cade shoved Marin into the crawl space and dived in after her, the jagged rocks tearing at his shoulders. They scrambled upward, the sound of Reeve's grunts and the heavy thud of a fistfight echoing in the hollow chamber below. Chapter 4. The Dead End Trail. They burst out of a rotted wooden hatch half a mile outside of town, gasping for air that didn't taste like sulfur and death. The storm had broken, leaving the desert floor a silver-blue mirror under a cold moon. Minutes later, Reeve tumbled out behind them. His lip was split, and he was clutching his ribs, but he was alive. "He's fast!" Reeve spat, wiping blood from his chin. "Too fast. He let us go. He wanted us to lead him out of the mine so he wouldn't have to find the trail himself." "Then we don't give him a trail to follow," Marin said, already heading toward a cluster of boulders where 3 tethered horses stood shivering. She'd hidden them there days ago, a failsafe for a life she always knew would end in a run. They mounted up and rode hard. They avoided the main stagecoach roads, sticking to the painted desert, a landscape of red spires and white alkaline flats that swallowed tracks and broke men's spirits. By dawn, the heat began to rise, shimmering off the ground in waves that made the horizon dance. Cade pulled the iron-bound ledger from his shirt. The leather was stained with his own sweat now. He opened it to the first page. There was no map. Instead, there was a list of names of men who had died in the war, and a single sentence written in a shaky hand. "The gold isn't buried in the earth. It's buried in the blood of the righteous." "What does that mean?" Cade asked, showing the book to Reeve as their horses plodded through the heavy sand. Reeve didn't look. He was staring at the horizon behind them. A single plume of dust was rising, steady, and relentless. "It means," Reeve said, his voice tight, "that Vance Thorne isn't just looking for money. He's looking for a reason to keep killing, and we just gave him the map to both." "The ghost wagon," Cade said, tapping a charcoal sketch in the corner of the page. "The ledger says it's 3 miles north of the Devil's Backbone. It marks the turnoff." Reeve wiped the salt from his brow, eyeing the shimmering horizon. "The ghost wagon is out in the open, Cade. It's a landmark for us, but it's a target for anyone with a spyglass. If we go there, we're exposed." "We're already exposed," Marin countered, pointing to the dust plume behind them. "Vance is gaining. If we don't find the turnoff to the hidden canyon now, we'll just be riding in circles until the horses drop. I can fix a wagon, I can fix a gun, but I can't fix a dead end. They turned their horses north, pushing through the sagebrush. An hour later, the wagon appeared, a skeletal remains of a prairie schooner, its white canvas long ago rotted away, leaving only bleached wooden ribs sticking out of the sand like a whale's carcass. It sat in the middle of a vast, flat basin of cracked mud. As they approached, Cade noticed something strange. The wagon wasn't empty. Propped up in the driver's seat was a scarecrow made of discarded Union uniforms, its hollow sleeve pinned to its chest. "It's a warning," Reeve whispered, pulling his horse to a halt. Cade dismounted, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. He walked to the wagon and looked inside the bed. There, carved into the floorboards in fresh, raw wood, were 3 words, "Welcome home, Cade." A cold shiver raced down Cade's spine, sharper than the desert wind. Vance hadn't just followed them, he had anticipated them. He knew Cade's name before they had ever met in that mine. "He's playing with us," Marin said, her voice trembling as she scanned the surrounding ridges. "He's not tracking us. He's herding us." Chapter 5. Shadows in the Dust. The realization that they were being steered hit harder than the heat. Every mile they traveled felt less like an escape and more like a delivery. "We can't stay here," Reeve ordered, his hand white-knuckled on his holster. "Into the rocks, now!" They scrambled for the cover of the jagged red spires of the Devil's Backbone just as the first thwip of a long-range rifle whistled through the air. The bullet didn't hit a person, it shattered the water barrel strapped to Reeve's saddle. The precious liquid gushed out, turning the red dust into a dark, muddy stain. "He's taking our water," Marin hissed, diving behind a boulder. "He's trying to dry us out." From the ridges above, a group of figures appeared. The resurrectionists. They didn't look like outlaws. They looked like starving crows in ragged duster coats, their faces covered in gray scarves to keep out the dust. They didn't charge. They simply sat on their horses, rifles leveled, watching the trio trapped in the rocks below. Vance Thorne stepped out from behind a spire, his black coat fluttering like wings. He didn't have his gun drawn. He held a silver flask, letting a slow trickle of water fall onto the parched ground. "Thirst is a powerful teacher, Cade," Vance shouted, his voice carrying perfectly in the thin air. "It strips away the lies of friendship. By tomorrow you'll be looking at your friends and seeing nothing but 2 gallons of moisture. Bring me the ledger and I'll let you drink." Cade looked at the shattered water barrel, then at Marin and Reeve. Their faces were already drawn, the desert heat beginning its slow, agonizing work. "I'm going down there," Cade whispered. "It's a trap, kid," Reeve growled, reaching for Cade's arm. "He'll put a hole in you before you can say a word." "He wants the ledger," Cade argued, pulling away. "He won't kill the only person who knows where it's hidden. I get close, I find out why he knows my name, and maybe I buy us enough time. To find a way out of these rocks." Cade stood up, holding his empty hands high. The sun beat down on his head like a hammer. He stepped out from the shadow of the boulders and began the long, slow walk toward the ridge where Vance Thorne stood. Every step felt like walking into an oven. The resurrectionists didn't move. Their rifles stayed leveled at his chest, cold and unblinking. As Cade reached the base of the ridge, Vance looked down, a thin, mocking smile touching his lips. He tossed the silver flask from one hand to the other. "Bold," Vance remarked. "Stupid, but bold. Just like your father." Cade stopped 10 feet away. "You knew him. You knew my father." "I knew the man he pretended to be," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "And I know the man he actually was, the man who walked away with a fortune while his brothers-in-arms died in the mud. He left you with nothing but a name and a broken watch, didn't he?" Vance stepped closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and old gun oil clinging to him. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto Cade's. "You aren't a hero, Cade. You're the son of a thief, and the only way to wash that blood off your hands is to finish what he started." He held out the flask, the water sloshing temptingly inside. "One. Drink. Just tell me where the ledger is tucked away back there, and we can talk about your inheritance." Cade's throat was a desert of its own. He looked at the flask, then back at the rocks where Marin and Reeve were hiding. He could feel the weight of the brass shell casing in his pocket, the one with Vance's name on it. Cade's fingers twitched. He wasn't looking at the flask anymore. He was looking at the bone-handled grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at Vance's hip. "I'm my father's son, all right?" Cade rasped. He lunged. It was a desperate, messy move born of heat stroke and adrenaline. His left hand snatched the silver flask, while his right hand clawed for the gun. He felt the cold iron of the barrel, his fingers closing around the grip. But Vance was faster than a man of his years had any right to be. Vance didn't draw. He simply caught Cade's wrist in a grip that felt like a closing vise. With a sharpie twist, he slammed Cade into the dirt, the silver flask clattering away, spilling the precious water into the thirsty sand. "A thief's reach, but a boy's grip," Vance hissed, looming over him. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You chose the wrong side of the coin, Cade." A shot rang out from the rocks, Marin firing her derringer to create a distraction. The dirt kicked up inches from Vance's boot. "Go!" Reeves' voice echoed through the canyon. Cade scrambled to his feet, grabbing the half-empty flask as he bolted back toward the boulders. Vance didn't order his men to fire. He just watched, a dark silhouette against the burning sun, as Cade vanished back into the shadows of the Devil's Backbone. Chapter 6. The water mirage, the water Cade had fought for, wasn't water at all. Inside, the flask was a bitter, salted brine, a cruel joke designed to make their thirst even worse. "He's mocking us," Marin spat, wiping the salt from her lips after a single sip. "He's playing with his food." "We need a real source, or we're dead by noon tomorrow," Reeve said, his eyes scanning the ledger Cade had brought back. He pointed to a cryptic passage, "Where the shadow of the needle points at midday, the tears of the mountain hide." Marin looked up at the towering spire they were hiding under, a needle-thin rock formation. "The shadow? It's pointing toward that salt flat." They spent the next 4 hours trekking through a landscape that looked like a bleached bone. The heat was a physical weight, pressing them into the sand. Just as Cade felt his knees begin to buckle, Marin spotted it, a patch of vibrant, impossible green tucked into a crevice of the white flats. It was a hidden cistern, an underground spring protected from the sun by a natural stone overhang. They drank until their stomachs ached, the cool water bringing the world back into sharp, terrifying focus. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence of the desert was broken by a sound that shouldn't be there. The rhythmic tink, tink, tink of a hammer hitting a spike. Chapter 7. Night of the Blue Moon, they followed the sound to a narrow box canyon. Inside sat an abandoned wagon train, but it wasn't like the ghost wagon they'd seen before. These wagons were arranged in a perfect defensive circle, yet there was no sign of a struggle. Clothes were still hanging on lines to dry. A pot of coffee, long since turned to dust, sat over a cold fire pit. "Where is everyone?" Marin whispered, her hand hovering over her tools. Cade walked to the center of the circle. Propped up on a crate was a man, or what was left of one. He had been mummified by the dry air, his skin like parchment. In his hands, he held a hammer and a spike. He had spent his final moments carving symbols into the rock wall, hundreds of tiny, interlocking gold coins. "Gold fever," Reeve breathed. They didn't leave. They stayed here, obsessed with the idea that the gold was under their feet. They dug until they died of thirst, right on top of a dry well. Under the light of a rare blue moon, the canyon took on a haunting, ethereal glow. Cade looked at the silver watch. In this light, the radium dial wasn't just glowing, it was vibrating. "The watch," Cade said, holding it up. "It's not just a timepiece, it's reacting to something in the rock." Suddenly the horses whinnied, in terror. From the darkness of the wagons, a figure emerged. He was gaunt, his clothes hanging off a frame that was little more than a skeleton, his eyes wide and vacant.